from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome back to STRAT, or for those of you who haven't heard it before, welcome to STRAT. We're going to have a little strategic risk assessment talk looking around the world, kind of framing the global risk environment, if you will. A lot of things that impact us, impact markets, impacts travel, where we go, where we don't go. That's been a big issue. Impacts global supply chains, obviously. Impacts the international financial system in major ways. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things. Some are further afield. I will talk about the Russo-Ukraine war situation, talk about some of the things involving President Donald Trump and what he has said, some of the things being said by the Europeans, some things said by President Zelensky of Ukraine, and others. I'm then going to take a little trip south, going to go down to the Middle East, talk quite a bit about the Gaza situation, and it is really interesting what is shaping up down there. And we're at a kind of a strategic inflection point regarding which way it's going to go, certainly. And the ceasefire, which is still in effect, could fall apart. Then again, it could go into phase 2 of the ceasefire. They're right on the edge. March 1 is the deadline for phase 2 implementation, the end of phase 1 ceasefire. So we're going to talk about that, talk about what's happening there. And then we're going to take a big trip across the Atlantic and fly over the Gulf of America into Mexico, which Mexico surprisingly does not refer to it as the Gulf of America. Don't know why. Anyway, although I am hearing rumors that in Copenhagen they call it the Gulf of Denmark, and I'm trying to get that firmed up. But with that, I'm going to talk about what's happening with U.S. presence. There's wide reports of a lot of intelligence assets being used, not just along the border, but actually flying over Mexican sovereign territory, and U.S. special operations, special forces actually working side-by-side training Mexican Marines for amphibious operations, counter-cartel operations, and of course, we'll talk all about that. So anyway, a lot of things we're going to get into, and let's get going. First off, let's talk about the situation with Ukraine and Russia. After a lot of back and forth, there was this sudden deal where Secretary Rubio was flying over to the Middle East regardless. He had already, Secretary of State Rubio had already went over, met with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. That was a very busy week, the week before last. A Munich security conference was going on, all sorts of things. There was even a report that apparently Secretary Rubio's plane had a problem en route to Munich and had to turn around and come back. So he was actually delayed getting over to Europe. So that was rather interesting. And I never did find out. I'm assuming it's just a mechanical issue or something with planes. These things do happen. Although I will say with all the aviation mishaps that have been happening in such a quick sequential order, I imagine everybody is erring on the side of extreme caution anytime anything goes on like that. Anyway, he's been all over the place, but he was down there. And then he went down and they had a rather short fuse meeting, if you will, in Saudi Arabia with Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia. And Lavrov had some of his senior officials also with Secretary Rubio. He was there in the lead. Obviously, Steve Witkoff was there as well. But also, they were discussing the situation with the Ukraine-Russo war. Now, this caused a lot of anger and frustration with the Europeans because they were not invited. It caused more than a little frustration with President Zelensky of Ukraine because they're talking about Ukraine, the disposition of Ukraine, to talking to one of the combatants of the country that invaded Ukraine. And Ukraine was not invited to that meeting either. And President Zelensky was obviously not thrilled with that situation. Interestingly, he was in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. He was actually down there right next door to Saudi Arabia. So for him to physically just pop over to Saudi Arabia for that meeting would not have been a logistics hurdle at all because he was already in the neighborhood. But he was not invited. He went up, met with President Erdogan up in Turkey, which I think was sending a signal elsewhere as to Ukraine is shoring up its ties with other major partners in the region. And they had this meeting, and they came out of the meeting. Nothing was really resolved. This wasn't this meeting, and certainly the White House has talked about this. Secretary Rubio has talked about this. Was simply to open discussions with the Russians. And I want to just do a little backdrop here. Putin has been, even though President Trump campaigned over and over that this war would end on day one, he was going to end this war, he would have this all solved. Obviously, day one came, the war didn't end. He's clearly frustrated by the fact that he was not successful in what he said. I'm sure he's kind of wondering about how strong his influence is with Putin. And Putin had consistently, during the transition period, basically vocalized pushback on ending the war, not satisfied with the terms that were being out there, being pushed forth out there. I think part of this is, and certainly for President Trump, it's kind of a reset to try and push this thing along. Now, while all this is going on, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, U.S. Army retired, special envoys, very senior advisor to President Trump, looking at these matters. Also, someone who's appeared on the news consistently over the years as one of the top voices in the war in Ukraine. He was meeting in Europe, and then he went over and met President Zelensky in Ukraine, and came out of that meeting praising President Zelensky's courage. And it sounds like it was a very positive meeting. Now, much was made about the fact they didn't have a press conference. There are reasons they didn't have a press conference. One of the big reasons is that President Trump had made some rather unusual statements, all right? Basically, in so many words, parroting what Putin had been saying over the years. Of course, the biggest one was he said that somehow Ukraine was responsible for starting the war, which certainly brought a response from all of our European allies, a response from senior members of Congress. It brought response across the board on this. It brought response even kind of within his own administration. There was either silence, if you will, or some way to try and not say what he said, but try to kind of explain what he said. It was very interesting. And what's interesting as we're recording this, President Trump has come back and kind of said, well, okay, Ukraine didn't actually start the war, but there was a period here where this was going on right when Keith Kellogg was meeting with President Zelensky, and obviously that was one of those things. I mean, that literally is, and that was where this thing kind of took off, was because President Zelensky's response when he heard that was to say that President Trump was living in a, quote, disinformation space, unquote, which is basically a way of saying he's basically listening to whatever Putin has been saying and repeating it, is what he was basically saying. President Trump also called President Zelensky a dictator and mentioned the fact they haven't had elections, which again brought a strong response from European allies and others around the world, and a strong response to the U.S., certainly a strong response in Ukraine. And the issue there was that obviously Ukraine has been under martial law while the war's been going on. They don't have an ability really to hold an election, certainly not. It's difficult to hold an election when 20% of your territory is actually controlled by an enemy force. So certainly, they go back and say, well, the U.S. held an election in World War II. Yes, but U.S. territory, with the exception of maybe the West Pacific territories, wasn't being physically held by a foreign power. And in Ukraine, they are being held by a foreign power. I certainly can't imagine countries that are in the midst of a big invasion turning around and holding an election during that time. It was an interesting point. It's something that Putin has said a lot. Putin says, well, I hold elections. Well, first off, during the elections, I don't think any Russian territory was actually being held. One could make an argument that Kursk, part of Kursk was held, but I don't think that was during the election. It wasn't held. And in fact, I know it wasn't during the election it was held. The other point is, if you want to call whatever they do in Russia elections, then I think that's truly a stretch of the imagination. Everything is completely rigged. All the opponents go to jail, or they die in jail, or somebody says something and they have a sudden inner ear problem and they fall out of a window on a high building, in which case they find themselves in stark violation of the Russian law of gravity. Let's just say there's not anything close to a real election that ever happens in Russia. So basically, this is just pure Russian propaganda is what it is. The other thing, which is interesting, when pressed on these issues, President Trump kind of goes into what I've started to hear as a standard refrain, where he'll say, well, if he'd been president, the invasion would never have happened, and usually followed up by October 7th would never have happened. And it kind of goes down that track. And I've heard him say this over and over again. And it is kind of interesting. And frankly, he says it for a long time, and it does have the effect of nobody really follows up on that because of if nothing else, the amount of time it takes to answer that question. And usually the press pool at that point wants to get other questions, or at that point, President Trump will point to a different reporter and they'll go with that question. So there is no follow-up question. So it is actually, I got to give him a point on that from a strategic communication standpoint. It does seem to work for him, that he goes down that refrain. But that gets to the issue that why is it that President Trump why is he switching U.S. policy away from Ukraine? And that literally goes back to 2016. You have to remember, and certainly during his first term in office, you got to remember that President Trump was looking at Hunter Biden's relationship with a company that Hunter Biden was working with in Ukraine. He was trying to put together the pieces that Hunter Biden was basically the only reason he had that contract, which frankly, there's a lot of reasons to believe this may be true, was that because of his relationship with his father, prior to 2016 was the vice president of the United States. All right. And so he was trying to get that together. So he asked Zelensky to investigate that matter, which is a big ask. He asked him to pass information to the U.S. on that matter, which was a big ask. And basically was trying to get President Zelensky to, provide evidence showing corruption within the Biden family, which would hit on Joe Biden. And Zelensky refused. The other part of that is, if you remember, Paul Manafort was, for a period of time in 2016, was the campaign manager for president, then candidate Trump. And then he wasn't, but he had been doing lots of campaigns, to include, he had got paid very well for doing the consulting as a political advisor to the Ukrainian president before Zelensky, that was the pro-Putin lackey president that the Ukrainian people rose up in 2014 with massive protests all over the country and kicked out of office. All right. And you may, if you really want to go back, you can see where his main opposition was actually poisoned clearly by Russian intelligence services, in an attempt to assassinate him. So let's just say it was a very nasty period of time. And that was Paul Manafort, who was, for a period of time, President Trump's campaign manager. And so obviously some of that stuff, that very, obviously some of that was, President Trump was a little irritated, angry, whatever, by being rebuffed on his ass. Paul Manafort certainly must have filled Donald Trump's ear with a number of different things that you can imagine. So let's just put it this way. A lot of the stuff going on with Zelensky, with Donald Trump, is personal. All right. Has less to do with geopolitics. I mean, some to do with geopolitics, but a lot of it, I think, is he's just personally irritated, mad, frustrated, angry. I have heard incensed used by various analysts at Zelensky personally, because way back when he didn't do this. If you remember, President Trump had actually held back sending military aid, specifically Javelin anti-armor, anti-tank missiles, desperately needed by the Ukrainians, not because they were in a war, but they were getting ready in case there was a war. He had actually held back a U.S. sale of those weapons to Ukraine. And of course, if you recall the beginning of the war, Javelin anti-tank missiles were like the heroes. They were incredibly useful in staunching the Russian invasion, turning them back. Basically the great equalizer on the battlefield with Russian armor was that these missiles were just so capable of doing stuff. Proved, that was not an insignificant weapon sale. And certainly the Ukrainians, and actually U.S. military officials knew that that would be absolutely crucial because they knew the terrain, they knew the type of warfare that was going to take place, and they knew how important that was going to be. This whole back and forth thing has caused a really strong reaction. Members of Congress are incensed. Our European allies are incensed. Ukraine, I think someone's having to pull back President Zelensky from saying any more because every time he says something, you're going to get a reaction from Donald Trump that's going to be very, very strong. And it's usually very personal. And I want to go back to this. A lot of this is just purely personal. This goes back a lot of years. This goes back literally 9 years that this is very personal for Donald Trump. And if you go back to 9 years, well, that's right after the 2014 popular revolt, if you will, that overthrew the pro-Russian, pro-Putin lackey government in Ukraine, and that's of course following the little green men, infiltration and takeover of parts of the Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula that was orchestrated by Russia at the time, and that's certainly what got Ukraine looking at Russia as a military foe on the battlefield and started what had become a low-grade war that turned into a very high-grade war 3 years ago. All right. The Senate actually has put together a resolution, and this was GOP members of the Senate put together a resolution making it very clear that Russia started that war. Just to send a message. There's no binding effect on it, so to speak, but it was basically a message from the GOP side, and certainly the Democrats would definitely join in on that, to say that, hey, look, Russia did not start this war. That was clearly Russians. With that said, since the work on introducing that resolution, as I mentioned, President Trump has kind of changed his tune on that and said, okay, Russia started the war, or at least he said Ukraine didn't start the war, but we'll see. We've seen some back and forth on that. So I think that's a big shift on what's going on. Now, there's a lot of thought that everything we're seeing here is part of a grand negotiation strategy, that this is all very well thought out, that they're doing this to lure Putin into a negotiation where they can get a ceasefire. I think a lot of it is that there's a lot of political fortunes tied to the ceasefire. And I think that basically President Trump wants to see an end to the war. I think he's a little less concerned about how it ends in terms of who controls the ground and more concerned about just ending the war. And that's really what a lot of experts who've looked at this kind of look at it and they go, he just really wants to end the war. And right now, the problem is the end of the war seems to be take Putin's positions and end the war. Now, with that said, there are some interesting things that have been kind of happening with that. All right. The U.S., while this is going on, there was an offer some weeks back talking about the U.S. would take a position of ownership with rare earths. And Ukraine happens to be one of those countries with a lot of rare earths. And I've talked about this before. The issue was the U.S. came back with an agreement where I think we were asking for like 50% ownership of the rare earths. It was an incredible amount of money. We're talking $500 billion in rare earths and stuff. And the U.S. took a position that we had given $350 billion to the Ukrainians, and we wanted repayment. Well, first off, none of the money that we sent over to Ukraine was ever stipulated that it was going to be repaid. This was military aid. This was not lend-lease or a loan or anything like that. Now, the Europeans have done some different stuff with the Russian assets where it was actually used as collateral for a loan, and I've talked about that in previous discussions as well, and also the potential of what could be done with doing that. And so, but this has been kind of framed that the Europeans are getting paid back, the U.S. isn't getting paid back, this isn't fair, we should be getting paid back. And actually, in looking at it, President Zelensky came back and says, no. So actually, if you want to look at military aid, it was actually closer to about 74 billion, maybe 75 billion. I just heard the foreign minister of Poland talking about he thought it was around 100 billion, maybe. So there was a big gap in terms of whatever that would represent if it was to be paid back. And then what would that? It was supposed to be for continued military aid. But the other military aid, military support was very ambiguous within the agreement. So it wasn't clear if Ukraine was really getting anything other than go get them. And that was pretty much it. So it wasn't really clear what Ukraine was going to get out of this agreement. Mike Waltz, a senior advisor the national security advisor, I should say, came out and said, Ukraine should take the deal, but it's a very onerous deal. And then, of course, more recently, there was talk about cutting Starlink service to Ukraine, basically disabling their communications, command and control capabilities, their ability to target on the field of battle, obviously meaning without that, Ukraine would suffer greater losses and have less effectiveness in stopping the Russians. Really is a phenomenal gift, if you will, a battlefield tactical operational strategic gift to Russia and Russian forces and Putin if that was to happen. It was a stunning thing saying you were going to turn off Starlink service and making it sound like the U.S. was paying for that Starlink service when, in fact, Poland's been paying for that Starlink service for quite some time. So I got to tell you, there's some hardcore stuff going on back and forth in terms of the negotiation here to make this happen, and all this is happening at the same time. Now, I don't think that certainly Zelensky he has said before he's interested in making a deal. He could negotiate with rare earths. There's also gas and oil stuff. There's a lot of other things that are technically outside of the rare earth spectrum, but certainly very valuable minerals that the U.S. needs that come from Ukraine. But the deal on the table is not a great deal, and I don't think it's gonna have to get negotiated much further. And I hope that the U.S. is serious about negotiating. And if that was an opening offer, I'm not claiming to be the expert of all things in negotiation, but I don't think that offer was a great offer to begin with. And it's certainly not going to be something that they're going to get anytime soon. The other thing I would point out, too, is that Europe is starting to step up. They've come together in interesting ways. Now, there is an election in Germany where there's more of a center-right coalition that's going to take over the government as opposed to the center-left coalition that currently is holding it. I'm not quite sure where that's going to go. It is going to change things in Europe. It's going to change the European Union in terms of how they do things. But Europe is stepping up. Poland is almost up to 5% of its GDP being invested in defense. Most of the countries there are certainly up to that 2% threshold. Many of them are working up to 3% or more threshold. Some of them are still laggards that are a little bit below. I don't want to name names. Spain, Portugal. I don't want to name names, but they need to kind of bring it up to a higher threshold. But there is something there, and there is a proposal that's out right now that the Europeans are looking at putting a 30,000 person military force as a peacekeeping force. That's pretty substantial, although I would make an argument that if you really want to stop the Russians, you need to look at somewhere between 100 to 200,000 as a peacekeeping force. And I don't think anywhere in Europe they could put together that kind of force out there. But if you want to make a real deterrence, if you want to stop the Russians cold, you put about 200,000 troops. And that's not troops. I'm talking about all the stuff that goes with that on the border to stop the Russians from moving. So anyway, but 30,000 is significant. Now, Russia's been making gains at horrendous losses, but Russia's got some big problems. They've actually reportedly been selling their gold reserves just to keep things going. So in other words, they're basically selling the farm just to basically keep the war going. All the economic news out of Russia is really bad. There's certainly a lot of propaganda that Russia produces, say, hey, our economy's growing, it's doing great, it's doing all those other things. I've never seen anything saying their economy is doing great. What I've seen is they're hiding the statistics and they're cooking the books to make it look like things are happening. They've been using horses to move equipment on the field of battle. They don't have enough rolling stock to even move troops up to the front line. The troops are having to, reportedly hike to the front lines, 10 kilometers or more. Part of it is because of the proliferation of drones on the battlefield, that every time they put armor or tanks out there, certainly, but armor personnel carriers or trucks or whatever, trucks get taken out in a heartbeat by drones. So long story short, they literally can't move in a modern battlefield environment on the battlefield. And it's so bad on the medical side that they've been sending Russian troops to North Korea. I'm stunned when I heard this. I was like, what? First, you got North Korean troops basically getting destroyed, decimated, fighting for the Russians, and Kursk fighting the Ukrainians. But then you've got them sending them medical aid in North Korea. If anyone knows anything about the absolutely abysmal, horrific state of medicine and medical care in North Korea, it makes you shake your head. It's like, you might die. You're going to North Korea. You will die. Okay, that's kind of how that rolls out. So that's just absolutely stunning that's going on. So Russia is in a very serious, I mean, I'll take away from the serious plight, obviously, that Ukraine is in, but Russia is in a serious, desperate state. And the Europeans are basically saying, hey, look, we're going to step up and keep Ukraine going. And I don't think anybody doubts that Ukraine can't keep fighting throughout this year. Even if the U.S. kind of stands back and says, we're going to send the aid or whatever, you can literally have the U.S. negotiating directly with Russia on a peace agreement, and the Europeans and Ukraine saying, yeah, that's nice, and just ignore them. That's a very significant possibility of what could happen. All right. By the way, just a little statistic, Ukraine, talk about drones on the battlefield, 70%, by some reports, 70% of the battlefield losses that Russia is suffering are by drones. That's how ubiquitous drones have become on the battlefield. I think last year, just Ukraine, produced about 1.5 million drones. This year, they are projected to produce 4.5 million drones. Yes, a lot of drones get shot down, but that is an amazing number. So I just want to throw that out there. All right, let's switch over to Gaza. You may recall that President Trump kind of stunned the world when he talked about the U.S. taking ownership of Gaza, that all the Palestinians would move out of Gaza, and that the U.S. would lead reconstruction of Gaza as a ownership, implying sovereign ownership of the Gaza territory, and potentially create a, quote, Riviera, unquote, of the Middle East on the Mediterranean with the idea of location. Okay. And it's not a new idea. I think Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, had voiced something like this some years back. Anyway, there's a problem with that. You force all the Palestinians out by force them out. That's a violation of the Geneva Convention. We're a signatory of the Geneva Convention. I don't think the president can just unilaterally pull us out of the Geneva Convention, since the Senate confirms treaties. So that's an issue right there. Obviously, to all the Arab countries, and certainly other countries around the world, it looks like a resurgence of imperialism. The U.S. taking sovereign control of a territory far afield from certainly the U.S., but something like that. So obviously that's causing massive repercussions, and that's being looked at everywhere. I mean, they're looking at Asia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. All of our staunch partners in the Pacific are watching what's happening in the Middle East and Europe with their eyes wide open, saying, I'm not sure about this, and having some significant questions about their very close ally, the United States. So that's something that's got everybody, not just the Europeans and other Arab countries in the Middle East, but everybody kind of focused on what's going on there. And then the cost of reconstruction. In that discussion, it was like, well, the U.S. will be in charge of reconstruction, but we're not going to pay for it. And it went pressed on, well, there is sovereign territory, so we're going to have military presence in the whole America First thing, not getting involved in these foreign adventures, putting military troops overseas. The White House came back and said, no, we're not going to have boots on the ground, which left a lot of questions. If you're not going to have boots on the ground, how do you plan to control the territory? How do you plan to safeguard the territory? And if you're not paying for the reconstruction, and it was kind of said, well, other countries in the region will step up and do this, and kind of looking at Saudi Arabia and stuff. And there was just a lot of questions. Now, with all of that said, was this just a big negotiation gambit? And that's been a kind of a thought. Certainly the Arab states have not stepped forward. They haven't come out there and talked about doing this. And now they are. Now they're coming together. Saudi Arabia is saying a lot of things. Obviously, none of them want to see this forcible relocation of the Palestinians out of Gaza. And so now they're having to step up. They're having to kind of get off the dime and come up with a realistic proposal. The situation with Hamas, they've all kind of agreed that Hamas cannot be the governing entity in Gaza. There's a proposal out now that there'll be a new technocratic Palestinian government that will be put in place, not the Palestinian Authority that's out there, that's floating around. There's a Cairo meeting that's going next week with all the Arab countries around there. So Saudi Arabia has really kind of stepped into a big role here because they actually have the money that could potentially pay for reconstruction. Jordan and Egypt's position is they're absolutely opposed to the Trump proposal, but it's also forcing them to move quickly to come up with this counter proposal. So with all that said, as much as it's caused a ripple, and certainly President Trump is known for causing ripples, it has forced these Arab countries to kind of sit back from a passive standpoint to do something, because there was a gap. There was nothing. There was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So President Trump filled it with an option that the Arab countries obviously don't want to see happen. Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others obviously do not want to see that occur, but they are forced to come up with a realistic, workable alternative, one that would be acceptable to Israel and one that would be acceptable to the United States. So we'll see where that goes. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about Mexico. There's reports of rivet joint, P-8 Poseidon, intelligence collection aircraft flying up and down the border. These are extremely high value, highly capable intelligence collection platforms. We've used them all over the world for a variety of things. Now they're flying up and down the border, which tells you how much focus we are putting on the border. And it also tells me indirectly how much fidelity that we have of knowledge of what's going on the ground around the border. And I'm not going to get into all specifics of that, but I will say that when you fly these platforms out there, you can collect a lot of intelligence. All right. So this is a big shift. The other thing that came out is that there's MQ-9 Reapers literally flying over Mexican territory, tracking Mexican cartel movements, Mexican cartel positions, Mexican cartel activities across the board. That's a sort of high-value intelligence that can be used for targeting purposes. And when I say targeting, I'm not talking about airstrikes or anything like that, although certainly there's been language that indicates that the U.S. is considering doing stuff, but definitely stuff that can be used for targeting certainly other intelligence platforms to gain greater knowledge of what's going on, or to assist Mexican authorities in going after these cartels. The problem perennially in Mexico has been that the cartels are such a huge chunk of the Mexican economy that they have phenomenal control throughout all facets of society, particularly law enforcement and the military. And traditionally, the only organization in the military that seemed to be able to resist the cartel stuff, and a lot of it was because of phenomenal firewalling, security procedures, a lot of basically keeping secret who the various members are, was the Mexican Marines. And I've had the pleasure of working with Mexican Marines. I've always been very impressed. Basically, the Mexican Navy and the Mexican Marine Corps, very impressive parts. Their Army has always had a problem with being permeated by cartel stuff. The money is just so overwhelming. And of course, the other part is the cartel. They're organized crime. And they make it very clear. They'll give you a choice. Take the money or we'll go after you and your family. And puts a lot of Mexican military officers in an impossible situation where they have to either work with the cartel or they could die and members of their family could be killed. So with that said, it's really difficult. And that's one of the reasons I think the U.S., that's really one of the reasons that I shouldn't say think, that is one of the reasons the U.S. is in there in the way it is now, is because there's this recognition that whatever President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico wants to do, she's got a very difficult time dealing with the cartels. And we've designated the Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations. We've expanded that now. We're looking at other countries like El Salvador, MS. And by the way, these cartels have a big footprint within the United States. So these newly designated terrorist organizations are operating within the U.S. borders, which gives an ability for law enforcement here to go after them in ways that they could not go after them before. So that's a big shift in what's going on. And also, it's interesting, it brings very kind of hidden, is it brings, from an intelligence standpoint, brings a couple of big programs together. One is the counter-drug program and the counterterrorism programs here in the United States. Counter-drug goes back to the 1980s, the war on drugs, if you will. I'm a veteran of that. I spent a lot of years working on that. So that brings together things under the Office of National Drug Control Policy, such as the proliferation around the country of high-intensity drug trafficking areas and all the intelligence capability and enforcement capability there, along with all the homeland security stuff like the intelligence fusion centers, regional and state all over the country, and all the stuff that's going on there. So it is interesting. I've actually seen that, though, in various different states and localities, that counter-drug, counter-terrorism, homeland security, the counter-drug enforcement side were basically kind of informally merging in a lot of ways. Whatever line was getting very blurry simply for a variety of reasons. A lot of times it was the counter-drug guys that were doing this before, and after 9/11, they kind of moved over to the Homeland Security stuff, and that was basically they're kind of following the federal money, if you will. But I've seen that before, so that's very interesting what's happening there in terms of capabilities. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that from last year at this time, illegal border crossings are down 94%. So say what you will, a lot of this stuff is having a direct impact on the border. So anyway, I've covered a lot of different things. We went to Russia, Ukraine. We've talked about certainly a lot of political angles. And by the way, I will stand back a little bit. All right. And I've said this on the air multiple times. President Trump, Donald Trump, he's an entertainer. Okay. He had a hit show that was on television for a number of years, The Apprentice, Celebrity Apprentice. And I will tell you that I don't think I ever saw one episode of Celebrity Apprentice. I just want to make that very clear. Although it did very well in the ratings, it was on for a lot of years. And that's kind of where he built his brand, if you will, that moved him right into politics, was from that. But the other thing, too, is President Zelensky is also an entertainer. And he, how he got to be president, in some ways, is due to the fact he starred in a TV show where he played the president of Ukraine. So anyway, they both know how to play to the cameras. They both know how to say dramatic things that get into the press and stuff like that. And if you want to say, very subtle diplomatic things on the world stage, that's great. It's not going to get you headlines. It's not going to get you attention. It's not going to move the dial. If you say things that are dramatic, sudden, stuff like that, it gets everybody's attention. And right now, there's big negotiation trying to end the Russo-Ukraine war. All right. Big negotiations trying to deal with Gaza and all the other issues surrounding October 7th and all these other places as well in the Middle East. Big negotiations. So you're going to hear you're hearing this language. And I have to say, part of that is it's negotiation play. And Donald Trump does it differently. He does it very much in the public space. Whereas, the previous administration under Biden, a lot of negotiation stuff. Yeah, there were press conferences and stuff, but a lot of the stuff was kind of quiet that was going on behind the scenes. Was certainly not as dramatic by anything. And frankly, it didn't have a lot of, you could sit there and say what you will, but, the Biden administration was working very hard to try and get a ceasefire. Couldn't get it in place. Donald Trump gets elected, says what he says. Next thing you know, you got a ceasefire in place. All right. Yes, it started under the Biden administration, but some of this stuff does seem to work. So I just want to point that out. All right. Anyway, lots of discussion. I'm sure I'll get a few comments online about this. And just for reference, I do regularly appear on certainly Fox Live now, and of course News Nation, other local stations all over the place, tied to both of those larger network organizations, if you will. And of course my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube. Please go there. You'll find all my media things, my television interviews that are posted end up getting reposted.